The studio was laughing at Dean Martin's drunkenness until he said that one sentence, and Johnny Carson's face completely changed. It was a Tuesday night in 1974. The Tonight Show was in full swing. Johnny Carson behind his desk in that effortless way he had, the audience warm and ready, Doc Severinsen and the NBC orchestra providing that familiar musical backdrop that millions of Americans associated with the end of their day. Dean Martin walked onto the stage. The audience erupted. Dean was always a favorite, the Rat Pack legend, the smooth crooner, the guy who made drinking look like an art form. He waved to the crowd with that lazy, charming smile, his tuxedo slightly rumpled, bow tie already loosened. He carried a rocks glass with amber liquid sloshing gently as he moved. Johnny stood to greet him, shaking his hand, that trademark Carson grin in place. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dean Martin!" More applause. Dean settled into the guest chair with the careful coordination of someone who'd had several drinks but was still managing. He raised his glass toward the audience in a mock toast. They loved it. "Dean, how are you tonight?" Johnny asked, settling back into his chair. "Johnny, I'm wonderful. Absolutely wonderful." Dean's words had that slight slur, that musical quality alcohol gives to speech. "I had a few before I came here. Maybe more than a few." The audience laughed. This was the Dean Martin they expected, the lovable drunk, the guy who turned his vices into entertainment. It was part of his persona, had been for years. Dean the drunk. Dean the playboy. Dean who didn't take anything seriously. Johnny played along perfectly. "Just a few? Well, you know how it is, Johnny. You have one, then you have another, then you lose count." Dean took a sip from his glass. "Somewhere around drink number 7, life starts making sense." Big laugh from the audience. Ed McMahon chuckled from his announcer's spot. The band was smiling. This was good television, loose, fun, spontaneous. Johnny leaned forward on his desk, cards in hand, ready to move into the interview. "So Dean, I hear you've got a new album coming out." "You know what's funny, Johnny?" Dean interrupted, his voice still carrying that alcoholic musicality but something else creeping in. Something that didn't quite match the smile on his face. Johnny paused. Years of hosting had taught him to recognize when a conversation was about to shift. "What's that?" Dean looked down at his glass, swirling the liquid slowly. "Everybody thinks I'm drunk all the time. Like this is just what I do. Dean Martin, the drunk guy. The guy who doesn't care about anything." The audience was still chuckling, thinking this was set up for a punchline. "And you know what? I let them think it. It's easier that way." Dean looked up, directly at Johnny. "But you want to know the truth?" Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. Johnny set his cards down slowly. His expression shifted, the professional host's smile fading, replaced by something more genuine. More careful. "What's the truth, Dean?" Dean's hand holding the glass trembled slightly. "The truth is I started drinking because my son died, and I never figured out how to stop." The studio went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that happens when someone's waiting for a punchline. The kind of silence that happens when 300 people simultaneously realize they're witnessing something real. Dean Martin Jr., Dino, had died in a plane crash 3 years earlier. March 21, 1987. He was a pilot in the California Air National Guard. His F-4 Phantom jet had crashed into a mountain during a training mission. He was 35 years old. Everyone knew about it. It had been national news. But Dean never talked about it publicly. He'd shown up to performances, done his shows, maintained that easygoing drunk persona. The world had moved on, assuming Dean Martin had too, in whatever way Dean Martin processed grief, probably with another scotch and a joke. But here, on live television, in front of millions of viewers, Dean Martin's carefully constructed facade was cracking. Johnny Carson didn't move. Didn't reach for his cards. Didn't try to redirect the conversation to something lighter. He just sat there, hands folded on his desk, giving Dean space. People ask me all the time. Dean continued, his voice rougher now, the performance dropping away completely. They say, Dean, how do you do it? How do you keep going? And I want to tell them, I don't. I'm not going. I'm just moving. There's a difference. Ed McMahon had one hand pressed to his chest, his usual jovial expression replaced by open concern. Doc Severinsen had set down his trumpet. The entire orchestra was motionless. Dean took another sip from his glass. This? He held it up. This isn't a bit. This isn't Dean Martin being Dean Martin. This is a father who lost his son and doesn't know what else to do with his hands. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Johnny Carson was when the cameras weren't rolling. The public knew Johnny as the king of late night, quick-witted, charming, untouchable. But people who worked with him knew something else. Johnny Carson understood pain. His own childhood had been difficult, an emotionally distant mother, a complicated relationship with approval and affection. His personal life was messy, multiple divorces, strained relationships with his own sons. Johnny rarely talked about it. He kept his private life private with an almost militant discipline. But it meant he recognized pain in others. He knew what it looked like when someone was performing to survive. And he knew Dean Martin wasn't performing anymore. Johnny glanced briefly toward the control room, toward the producers who were probably frantically trying to figure out if they should cut to commercial. Then he made a decision that would define this moment, and arguably, his entire legacy as a host. He stood up. Not the casual standing he did for comedy bits. This was deliberate. He walked around his desk, crossed a few feet to where Dean sat in the guest chair, and did something he'd rarely done in 30 years of hosting. He sat down on the edge of the guest chair platform, right next to Dean. Close enough to reach out and touch him. The cameras scrambled to adjust their angles. The studio audience leaned forward collectively, 300 people holding their breath. Dean, Johnny said quietly, his voice carrying that rare quality of absolute sincerity. You don't have to do this right now. We can talk about the album. We can tell some stories. We can do whatever you want. Dean shook his head. No, Johnny. I need to say this. Because everyone thinks I'm fine. And I'm not fine. And maybe I need to stop pretending I am. Johnny nodded slowly. Okay. Then let's talk about Dino. The use of the name, Dino, not your son or Dean Jr., was so specific, so personal, that Dean's composure finally broke completely. His face crumpled. Tears started streaming down his cheeks. The rocks glass in his hand began to shake. Johnny reached out and gently took the glass from Dean's hand. He set it down on the floor beside them, a simple gesture, but profound. Taking away the prop. Taking away the performance aid. Tell me about him, Johnny said. And Dean did. For the next 12 minutes of live television, Dean Martin talked about his son. About teaching him to fly. About the pride he felt watching Dino join the Air National Guard. About the last conversation they'd had, 2 days before the crash. About nothing important, just a phone call, just a father and son checking in. I told him I loved him, Dean said, his voice breaking. At the end of the call, I said I love you, kid. And he said it back. And that's the last thing we ever said to each other. The audience was crying. Not politely dabbing eyes, full, open crying. Ed McMahon's face was wet with tears. Members of the orchestra had their heads down. Johnny sat there beside Dean, occasionally asking a gentle question, mostly just listening. At one point, he handed Dean his own pocket square to wipe his eyes. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. In the control room, producers were having urgent, whispered arguments through headsets. This was completely off script. The sponsor slots were coming up. They had another guest waiting. The show had a rhythm, a structure, and this was destroying it. But Johnny Carson, through some combination of hand signals and just ignoring his earpiece entirely, made it clear they weren't moving on. They weren't cutting to commercial. They were staying here, in this moment, for as long as Dean needed. It was a decision that could have cost millions in advertising revenue. It was a decision that violated every rule of television production. It was a decision that put genuine human connection above entertainment value. And it was the decision that made this night legendary. Dean eventually steadied himself enough to continue. You know what the hardest part is, Johnny? Everyone wants me to be okay. Everyone wants the fun Dean back. The guy who doesn't care. The guy who just drinks and laughs and nothing touches him. But that guy died when Dino died, Johnny said quietly. Dean nodded. Yeah, he did. Johnny was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that would be quoted for decades afterward. Then maybe it's time to let people meet the real Dean. The one who's still here. The one who's grieving. That man deserves to exist too. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Dean reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hands were still shaking as he unfolded it carefully. This is a letter, Dean said, his voice barely above a whisper. That Dino wrote me when he first joined the Guard. I carry it everywhere. I've read it maybe 1,000 times. Johnny leaned in slightly. Would you want to share it? Dean looked at the letter, then at Johnny, then out at the audience. 300 people who had come expecting comedy and instead were witnessing something far more important. He wrote, Dad, I know you worry. I know you think flying is dangerous. But you taught me that when you love something, you don't let fear stop you. You taught me that by watching you perform. You get nervous before every show. I can see it, even when you hide it, but you go out there anyway because you love it. That's what I'm doing. I'm flying because I love it. And if anything ever happens, I need you to know, I lived exactly the way you taught me to live. Without fear. With love. And grateful for every single day. Dean's voice broke completely on the last words. He folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. The studio was silent except for the sound of crying. Even the hardened cameramen had tears streaming down their faces. Johnny Carson did something then that defined his entire career. He reached over and took Dean's hand. On live television, in front of millions of viewers, Johnny Carson held Dean Martin's hand while he cried. No joke to break the tension. No smooth transition to the next segment. Just two men, sitting together, one grieving and one bearing witness to that grief. After what felt like both an eternity and just a moment, Johnny spoke. Dean, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for letting us see the real you. And thank you for raising a son who wrote you that letter. Dean nodded, unable to speak. Johnny stood up slowly and addressed the audience and the cameras. We're going to take a break. When we come back, actually, I don't think we're coming back to anything else tonight. I think what we just witnessed is enough. More than enough. He looked at the control room, at the producers who were frantically gesturing about the schedule. He shook his head firmly. We're done for tonight. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The show ended 20 minutes early that night. Johnny walked Dean off stage personally, arm around his shoulders. Ed McMahon followed quietly. The audience sat in their seats for several minutes after the cameras stopped rolling, nobody quite ready to leave, everyone processing what they just experienced. In the days that followed, NBC received over 50,000 letters. Not complaints about the show ending early. Letters thanking Johnny for what he'd done. Letters from grieving parents. From people struggling with loss. From viewers who'd never seen anything like that on television before. Dean Martin never appeared drunk on television again. He performed. He sang. But the character, Dean the Drunk, retired that night. Johnny Carson kept a copy of Dino's letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. He never spoke about it publicly, but staff members who cleaned his office saw it there, worn from being handled, sitting next to his Emmy Awards. Years later, when Johnny retired, Dean sent him a note. It said simply, "Thank you for letting me be human." That night changed television. It showed that sometimes the most important thing a host can do isn't entertain. It's witness. It's stay. It's hold someone's hand while they fall apart, and trust that the audience will understand. They did.